Good evening, everyone. My name is Lawrence J. I'm the director at Rolling Ridge, and we welcome you to our third edition of Divine Friendships as we are exploring the Christian contemplative classics. Today, we're going to be looking at Francis de Sales and his writing on the Introduction to the Devout Life. And Francis de Sales lived from 1567 to 1622. He was a Catholic bishop of Geneva during the Reformation and was noted for his gentle approach to the religious divisions of his day. In the Introduction to the Devout Life, it resulted from letters and notes de Sales used for spiritual direction and gently insists that the pursuit of holiness is open to everyone regardless of their station in life. During our Divine Friendships, we're going to be considering three different ways that Francis's writing helps nurture our own divine friendships. And first, in our understanding of the first divine friendship within the Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit. Also, we'll be looking at how divine friendships impact our own relationship with God. And finally, how Francis's writing impacts our relationships with other people. Alan Dillingham is going to be our presenter today. And so I hand it over to Alan to lead us in this introduction of the devout life and overview of the life of Francis de Sales. I hand it over to you, Alan. Blessings to you as we begin our journey this evening.
Thank you, Lawrence. Lawrence covered most of the introduction that I was going to give about Francis de Sales. He lived in interesting times. He was, as Lawrence mentioned, he was the Catholic Archbishop of Geneva. But the problem at the time was it was in the middle of the Reformation, or actually the sort of second generation. And Geneva was the headquarters of John Calvin and the Calvinists. And it was really not, everybody sort of agreed that it was not safe for Francis de Sales to try to be ministering in Geneva at that time. Although he did engage in a lot of intellectual discussions with the Calvinists, and he was also at one time, well, there's sort of it's a mixed bag, really. At one time, his life was in danger. At another time, he was the Pope's emissary to the successor of John Calvin to see if they couldn't come to a rapprochement. But mostly what Francis de Sales did was he tried to be a good bishop and a good spiritual director. And most of his writings are basically letters that he wrote to his spiritual directees. Primarily, one was his cousin, who was the wife of the French ambassador to the court of the Duke of Savoy. Savoy at that time was an independent duchy between France and Switzerland. Now it's parts of Savoy are in France and in Italy and in Switzerland. So Francis de Sales lived an interesting life. He, as I said, he wrote the Introduction to the Devout Life, mostly of the encouragement of a Jesuit priest who saw some of the letters he had shared with his cousin and say, "You've got to make a book out of this." And so he did. And when you look at the Introduction to the Devout Life, it's primarily a how-to book, an instructional manual in trying to lead a devout life. It's divided into 5 parts. The first part is about choosing the devout life. Now, what is the devout life that Francis de Sales is talking about? He defines devotion or the devout life as simply the true love of God. That's how one should conceive of devotion. Um, when devotion adorns the soul, it's called grace. When it strengthens us to do good, it is called charity or love of neighbor. Now, for Francis de Sales, charity and devotion are no different from each other than fire and flame. Charity or love in action is spiritual fire, and devotion is that same fire burst into flames. Devotion consists, for Francis, of a certain spiritual agility and vivacity to do the works of the love of God. So what Francis de Sales was concerned about in his spiritual direction was basically trying to have people become devout. And for him, that meant becoming devout meant charity in action. It meant not just the love of God, but showing that love in the love of neighbor as well. And he was as much interested in developing a set of skills on the part of his directees as anything else. How could they be more skillful at being devout? What was that like? Francis said that the world tends to vilify devotion, but he wrote that it's actually sweet, happy, and lovable. And he called it true spiritual sugar that removes bitterness from suffering and sweetens consolation. Francis writes, devotion is the delight of delights and queen of the virtues, since it is the perfection of charity. That's from part 1, chapter 2. The introduction was also different in that it was addressed to each and every Christian, regardless of vocation, stage in life, or age or temperament. Holiness was a vocation for everyone. Devotion was for everyone. It wasn't just for people who were locked away in a monastery or cloister. It should be lived in action. Devotion must be exercised in different ways by each particular person and must be adapted to their strengths, activities, and duties of each particular person. So de Sales was a big believer that each particular person had sort of their own sets of virtues that they could practice. There was virtues in general, but depending on what your station in life was, or depending on what your responsibilities were, devotion would look different in your life than it would for someone else. So there he was really, he didn't have like a one size fits all cookie cutter type of approach. It was basically find your skills, find what you're good at, and do those things, and do those things well. True devotion perfects all things in Francis's view. It does no injury to one's vocation or occupation. So in a sense, it's no excuse to say, well, I can't be devout because I'm working in a smith shop, or I'm at court, or I'm in married life. You know, it's like, no, devotion is available to everyone and is meant for everyone. Now, if one is serious about choosing the road of devotion, Francis strongly recommends finding a good spiritual director. Such a faithful friend is a treasure of wisdom in sorrow and affliction, medicine to ease our hearts when spiritually afflicted. Francis counsels praying over finding a good spiritual director, one after God's own heart. He said that finding a good director is 1 in 10,000. But if you pray for one with a sincere heart, Francis believes that one will be provided. Francis goes on to say that a good spiritual director is the means by which God will befriend you and speak to you. So when you find a good spiritual director, trust him as you would an angel, a messenger from God. So Francis himself strived to be a good director, but he also encouraged people to find directors that would help them, and that was a really important part of seriously trying to live a devout life. Now, in the first book, Francis identifies purification as the first necessary step on the road to the devout life. One has to take a look at their life, examine it, and then try to improve. But this should be approached gently. Purification and healing take time, difficulty, and patience. Francis writes, the work of purging the soul neither can nor should end except with your life itself. We must not be disturbed at our imperfections, since our perfection comes in fighting against them. It's from part 1, chapter 5. Francis goes on to write, imperfections and venial sins cannot deprive us of spiritual life. It is lost only by mortal sin. Therefore, it only remains for us not to lose courage. Fortunately for us in this war, we are always victorious, provided that we are willing to fight. And that's also from part 1, chapter 5. So from Francis's perspective, we can only lose if we stop trying, if we give up. He indicates that it's a difficult road and that it's filled with imperfections. But the thing to do is not to get hung up on the imperfections, is to take it as part of the journey, and indeed as part of the process. So Francis is always balancing gentleness with persistence and perseverance. He's very comforting in many of the things that he says, but he's also challenging in that the goal is to have this true love of God expressed in actions. In the rest of the first part of the introduction, Francis provides a program of 10 exercises to purify the soul, to prepare for a general confession that would culminate in a resolution to serve God. So what he's providing in the first part is really a program. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the exercises he recommends or the program that he suggests people adopt. It is important to realize that Francis was concerned that people have some structure to live the devout life. Now, once chosen, the devout life must be continuously nourished. And this is the second part of the introduction that deals with prayer and the sacraments as means of developing the devout life. Francis writes, since prayer places our intellect in the brilliance of God's light and exposes our will to the warmth of his heavenly love, nothing else so effectively purifies our intellect of ignorance and our will of depraved affections. It is a stream of holy water that flows forth and makes the plants of our good desires grow green and flourish and quenches the passions with our hearts. So it's not enough to simply choose the devout life. One needs to feed it, particularly with prayer. Francis especially counsels mental prayer centered around the life of Jesus, using imagination, intellect, and affections. Francis was trained by the Jesuits, and if you're familiar with some of their spirituality, a lot of what Francis does is similar in terms of the structure that he recommends. Now, although his instructions for prayer are rather detailed and structured, the main aim is to kindle the affections. It's about the heart. So for Francis, it's not as important that you follow these particular guidelines for prayer as it is to connecting heart to heart with God in prayer. Now, Francis was a Catholic saint, so he had a strong stress on communion. But a lot of what he says about communion can also be said about prayer. And he writes, after you have received him, that is Christ, excite your heart to do homage to the King of salvation. Converse with him concerning your innermost concerns. Reflect that he is within you and has come there for your happiness. In fine, make him as welcome as you possibly can and conduct yourself in such manner that by your actions, all may know that God is with you. It's from part 2, chapter 21. So you have choosing the devout life in the first part, feeding the devout life in the second part. The third part of the introduction is about practicing the devout life, how to live a devout life in practice. And he recommends that people practice a particular virtue instead of trying to practice them all at once, but focusing on one to try to keep the mind better ordered and occupied. So choose a virtue that you're good at and develop it rather than beat yourself up over the ones where you're failing. Francis writes, undertake all your efforts with a calm mind and try to dispatch them in order, one after the other. If you make an effort to do them all at once or without order, your spirit will be overcharged and depressed, and that they will likely sink under the burden without affecting anything. So Francis is recommending a very, again, a very practical approach to the issue of living a devout life. Now, Francis particularly stresses following the little virtues, or what we might call the little virtues, of patience, meekness, humility, poverty, and forbearance towards neighbors. He says we have more opportunities to practice these little virtues rather than the great virtues of fortitude and magnanimity. So instead of trying to do great and big things, Francis recommends focusing on doing little things and doing them well.
Alan, can you just repeat that list again?
Sure. Patience, which is right at the top. Meekness, humility, poverty, and forbearance towards neighbors. So he says, focus on these instead of, trying to be brave or courageous. Focus on the little things that you can do every day and have many opportunities to do. And above all these, Francis particularly stresses patience, and in particular, patience with ourselves. Francis writes, the more perfect our patience, the more completely do we possess our souls. In correcting our own faults, we must deal with them in a calm, settled way. Anger should be avoided. It does not serve justice well. And as Francis writes, a father's gentle, loving rebuke has far greater power to correct a child than rage and passion. So patience, patience, patience. So again, this counterbalancing of patience and persistence. One is to be gentle with oneself, but one is to be trying to correct oneself, to become closer to God, to truly express the love of God. Friendship is of particular importance to devout life and requires close communication between friends. Francis recommends loving everyone with charity, but insists that people form friendships only with those who can share virtuous things. Francis writes, the higher the virtues you share and exchange with others, the more perfect your friendship will be. If your mutual and reciprocal exchanges concern charity, devotion, and Christian perfection, oh God, how precious this friendship will be. It will be excellent because it comes from God, excellent because it leads to God, excellent because its bond will endure eternally in God. How good it is to love here on earth as they love in heaven, and to learn to cherish one another in this world as we shall also eternally in the next. It's from part 3, chapter 19. Francis employs his reader to engrave and inscribe on her heart the holy and sacred motto, live Jesus. And he writes that in part 3, chapter 23. It's part of his introduction and part of his conclusion as well. Live Jesus. If Jesus lives in your heart, he will live in your conduct and be revealed in your appearance. In the fourth part of the introduction, Francis deals with obstacles to the devout life. He offers advice on how to deal with temptations that present themselves along the way. And he reminds his readers, no matter what temptations may come to you, and no matter what pleasure accompanies them, as long as your will refuses consent, not only to the temptation, but also to the pleasure, they should not disturb you, since God is not offended by them. So if you find that you're tempted and you're finding these obstacles, don't be concerned. Don't give in to them. Temptation, however, can lead to anxiety. And Francis writes, with the single exception of sin, anxiety is the greatest evil that can happen to a soul. I'll read that again because I think it's an important thing to keep in mind about Francis. With the single exception of sin, anxiety is the greatest evil that can happen to a soul. So Francis says, never look temptation in the face, but instead look solely to the Lord. He also recommends opening your heart to a spiritual director when facing temptation. So temptation is an issue, but anxiety is a bigger issue. And one should be patient with oneself when one is dealing with one's own frustrations, imperfections, temptations. The best defense against small temptations is not to be worried too much about them at all. Instead of struggling against small temptations, Francis recommends doing some contrary act of love. Don't focus on small, ordinary temptations, but turn to God instead. If you are at times of peace, Francis recommends perform many actions of virtue contrary to your weakness to strengthen yourself for the times of temptation. If opportunities to perform such acts do not present themselves, seek them out. So for temptation, Francis says, look to the Lord, don't be too disturbed by them, and in your stronger moments, work on developing your virtues, your skill sets, your love of God in practice, and that will help you during times of temptation as well. If the soul if the soul seeks to escape from its troubles by love of God, it will do so patiently, meekly, humbly, and calmly, looking to God for deliverance rather than its own efforts or industry. If it seeks escape out of self-love, depending on self rather than God, it will excite and wear itself out, searching for escape. The fifth part of the introduction is about renewing the divine life, and Francis here recommends making a yearly re-examination of the heart and its affections to renew and dedicate itself to the devout life. The fifth part mirrors the first part in that it consists of exercises to purify the soul, to prepare for a general confession, culminating in a resolution to serve God. And that is the introduction to the devout life. In a nutshell, there's many things he covers, many things he goes over. But what I think is more important for our purposes is not the laundry list of things that he tries to address, but the basic unity of approach that one should be calm and gentle with one's own imperfections, that one should seek perfection, which is the devout life, which is the love of God, but not to beat oneself up when one is failing them. Instead, to look to God and to realize that this is part of the journey, and to proceed gently and calmly with oneself. Now, I have a few, I'm sharing my screen now. There's a few quotes from Francis de Sales that I have put up on my blog that I've put on the main screen here in lieu of sending out cheat sheets that I usually do. I am putting this on your screen. These are just some of his sayings that can provide us with some inspiration and some food for thought and fodder for our discussion. I'm going to read through them and leave them up on the screen so you have them there for your reference. And then I'll open up for questions about Francis de Sales or the introduction. And from there, we'll go to a general discussion of your reactions. So never be in a hurry. Do everything quietly and in a calm spirit. Do not lose your inner peace for anything whatsoever, even if your whole world seems upset. Nothing is so strong as gentleness, nothing so gentle as real strength. Be who you are and be that perfectly well. Be patient with everyone, but above all with yourself. When you encounter difficulties and contradictions, do not try to break them, but bend them with gentleness and time. Friendships begun in this world will be taken up again, never to be broken off. True progress, quietly and persistently, moves along without notice. And as I said before, the best way to really get in touch with St. Francis de Sales is to have the pleasure of meeting a Salesian. They're around, there's a handful of them around the Philadelphia and Wilmington area. They have a house there, the Albans of St. Francis de Sales. And I found them really good at living out this gentle and persistent approach to the spiritual life. That's all I have. I can take any questions that you have.
Yeah, and Ellen, that's exactly what I was going to ask you about that last piece. And I heard John say, you know, he went to I think at a college or high school, whatever, and knew them. I've never even heard of this. It's not an order, like it's not like the Franciscans or Jesuits, right? Or is it? That's my question. I was kind of looking it up while you were talking, and I'm just not even familiar with the.
It is.
It is an order.
They're actually, it's a smaller order. And there's actually more than one order. John mentioned the Don Bosco Salesians,
right?
Which are different from the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales.
Okay.
And in some ways, Don Bosco, I heard of Don Bosco before I heard of Francis de Sales. So he sort of has it's it's sort of I don't want to say a division, but a difference among the Salesians. They weren't the Don Bosco Salesians are actually older than the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales, who are I don't want to say they're more focused on St. Francis de Sales, but they don't have the same emphasis on Don Bosco as the Bosco Salesians. Although don't ask me who Don Bosco was or what he did. I found out in the process of doing this that he was connected to the Salesians, or he was connected to Francis de Sales.
Well, I just want to say, I mean, I know we're going to go into discussion or questions, but I mean, everything that he says makes so much sense in terms of its kind of moderation or not, you know, I just very intrigued by him in terms of, you know, like I like, you know, you try the, you know, the little things and do them often. And I mean, just, it seems very reasonable, you know, as opposed to, you know, other ones that perhaps are just unattainable. So anyway, that's all I want to say. I'm very intrigued. Thank you.
Francis de Sales is good for quotes, like looking up some of his quotes on the internet. A lot of his quotes are in this same vein of patience and persistence.
So Ellen, as we move into our time, did you want me to lead in terms of the reflections about the divine friendships, or would you like to do that?
Right now we're just open for any questions that people might have about Francis de Sales or the introduction, and from there we're moving to a discussion. So I'm perfectly happy for you to facilitate that discussion for us. If people are ready to move on from that, if they don't have any burning urgent questions about Francis de Sales.
And so why don't we do this thank you, Ellen, for all the wonderful perspective that you provided about what it means to really live, quote unquote, this devout life. And so let's just take a few moments, as I know we're already in that silent space, to simply allow our head to descend from our head to our heart and begin to sit with some of the things that we've heard, and begin to consider how are Francis's teachings about the devout life and the introduction to the devout life really speaking to these three types of divine friendships that we're looking at. Is there something that we are learning about the relationship within the Godhead? Is there something that really speaks to your heart about your own relationship with God personally? Is there something that really is stirring within your own heart in regard to your own spiritual relationships and your own spiritual direction that you might be involved as well? And so let's just kind of take a few moments to reflect on all the things that we've heard and begin to move it into our own heart, so that we might be able to go forward with our hands, so to speak, and to be able to live in the truths that Ellen has brought to us this evening. So when you're ready, I invite you to unmute yourself and simply share about how some of the writings and the teachings of St. Francis de Sales are speaking to you personally at this time.
The gentleness part of his story is very attractive to me. And it reminds me of Benedict, who also tried to soften. I think Benedict was a lot earlier, some of the rules and strictness. And gentleness has been, he talked about, you mentioned, he said one thing at a time. Like, when I think of the fruits of the Spirit, gentleness is the one I work on, not all 7 or 8 of them. We have a little sign on the dashboard of the van next to how high the van is when we go onto bridges and all that kind of stuff. Give a soft answer. That's from Benedict, and it's that idea of gentleness with the neighbor, and that's very attractive to me. And any saint who has that approach is attractive. What I was really wondering about, I read a book on Kepler during the pandemic, and when you said Geneva, I think they're about the same time. Do you know any of that? It doesn't sound like Francis de Sales had much to do with science or Galileo, or was that they were fighting in Geneva? The Calvinists and the Protestants
Right.
were fighting each other, right? And the Jesuits, and
Well,
Francis de Sales must have been in the middle of that too.
yes, yes, he was. He, in terms of his own, the area where he was born and where he lived was outside of Geneva, and during that time, that area was very much taken up by the Reformation and the the Calvinist Reformation, particularly from Geneva. So there was a lot of agitation.
Yeah.
There was a lot of tension, a lot of agitation. Francis, when he was young, when he was about 18, he had developed, the debate about predestination was very strong in the area he was in. And he got into his mind that he was predestined to hell. And I think that part of his spirituality and his approach is a reaction to that earlier crisis that he had. Now, when he started his church career, he wrote a lot of pamphlets. So he was busy engaged in the intellectual arguments at first. And there was competition between the Catholics and the Calvinists in this area. And Francis de Sales was definitely competing, but at the same time, he was looking for a way to bring everyone together. As I mentioned in the introduction, the Pope had him be an ambassador to John Calvin's successor, either to try to negotiate, one view is that, he was trying to negotiate a rapprochement. Another view, he was trying to convert the Calvinists. In a sense, it's a little bit of both. So I think it's not a mistake to view Francis de Sales' efforts in that context. Now, he also had a reputation as he got older, he spent more of his time focusing on the spiritual direction, the ministry, less on the intellectual clash, more on how does one live a devout life, whether one is Catholic or Protestant. The introduction was translated into a number of languages, so it was read by Catholics and Protestants, and that was his intention, that it be shared. But like I said, it's hard to, he was the Bishop of Geneva, but his cathedral was 30 or 40 miles out of town because he couldn't show his face in Geneva.
So when I read about that
he was operating in.
it seemed like, there was so much fighting. It reminded me a lot of this time in our country, the Republicans and the Democrats and the
Yeah.
politics, and the idea that somebody could come up with gentleness, it surely was needed as it is now. And I think it's kind of, I think we expect that because it's a religious thing, but I think it's pretty revolutionary for the times. If you think of the times they're in, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, in my perspective, from my perspective though, it's what lasts.
Yeah.
It's like, Francis de Sales, his legacy is something that lasts out of that. I guess you could say that the bad blood lasts as well, but I think he's sort of a bridge for people.
I think echoing what Sandra was saying, I think that there is this sense that that the Salesian charism is very much needed today in terms of that sense of gentleness and being able to provide bridges where there is a lot of controversy and diversity and fighting, for lack of a better term, or warring, so to speak, and even warring theologically or politically or whatnot. And I think the thing that strikes me is that, when we think about the devout life, when I first started about the devout life, you think about all the spiritual practices that you need to do. And that really is not his understanding at all, I think, about the devout life. It really is living into that gentleness and that patience with yourself, which it's a bit of a spin, and yet it's really, I think that is really what is needed in this day and age. And so I love the quote that you have there. You said that he's like the king of bumper stickers. Well, you didn't say that, but it sounds like the king of bumper stickers. But you could put some of these phrases that you have up there on a bumper sticker, and they would fit very much in terms of our modern day. Be who you are and be that perfectly well. It's very much a modern perspective about the importance of loving ourselves, so to speak, and being patient with ourselves first, so that we can then, as it says, be patient with everyone, and above all, be patient with yourself. But it really begins with loving ourselves, recognizing God's love for us, so we can then be able to love others and to have that gentle spirit, even in the midst of the chaos that is going on. And so I find that charism and that example very much needed in the chaos and the disenfranchisement that people are feeling these days.
Yeah, I think he was the right person for the times, several of us has mentioned his gentleness, and I think that's how he came across to me. I mentioned the term piety, I think, when we first started. And he was, from what I recall, a person that could be a model, for practicing their Christianity. He was a diplomat in the best sense of the term, by trying to bring opposing sides more together. So that's part of why I think that he was the right person for the times. And he was, nobody, even when he was bishop, I think, really seriously questioned his approach to problem solving. If they did, it was probably just ignoring it. But so I think he set up a model for other people to follow. I know with the Salesians of Don Bosco, Don Bosco himself was interested in working with boys in the Industrial Revolution in factories and in I think Turin and other parts of Italy that were poor and uneducated, and he established trade schools and then later academic schools. And Don Bosco was a person that wanted the hands-on experience and didn't really want to run an order. So but the people in those industrial inner cities wanted, him to establish an order. So what he did was he kind of looked around and adopted St. Francis de Sales. And that's kind of how they became the Salesians of Don Bosco. They're his St. Francis de Sales because of his kind of unquestionable broad appeal, his piety, his meekness. What became a model for the priests that were working with the boys in industrial Italy, and a lot of other conflict areas with religious orders that were also looking for a patron did the same thing. The Salesians, part of the order that where I went to high school was the Salesians of Poland, and they adopted him as a patron too. And because of all of the strife and that was going on in Poland at the time, and to have St. Francis de Sales as a model of this kind of gentle diplomat was very much the kind of person that they wanted to be the patron of their order. And other countries did similar things, mainly countries that were subject to a lot of strife, wars, religious or political, and the priests in those countries that wanted to, that were not the regular clerics, that wanted to band together to achieve some mission, often, but had great odds to overcome because of all of this strife, oftentimes adopted him, St. Francis de Sales, as their patron.
He's also the patron saint of writers as well, because he wrote so many letters.
Lawrence, you were just, you're asking how it kind of spoke to us. And as I said, I'm just looking at the notes that was taken, and I have not read the book. But again, it seems like a path that I could attempt to follow. I mean, because it, I love, just as I said, I was glad that you repeated them, Alan, the patience, I thought you said neatness, not meekness, but anyway, humility, poverty, etc. And and I love the ideas, kind of like when you seek out the things so that you're prepared that when a temptation does come, you're more strengthened. It just seems like a kind of a reasonable, not easy, but a reasonable program to follow. Like, this is not like, sell all your possessions and go off to whatever. It just seems like, try little things, practice them, like when you said, choose one virtue and practice that one. Don't feel like you have to do all of them. Just get deeper and deeper in that one, and then maybe you move to another one. So I just found it, again, having known nothing about him, I just found it really helpful, his whole kind of philosophy on life, if you want to say. And how interesting, especially now, the fact that, you know, except for sin, the greatest evil is anxiety. I mean, which is such a, I think, a prevalence in our society now. And, you know, how to counter that is really how I'm looking at my notes over here. But so I want to reflect on that. Is the book that you were quoting from, the introduction, all that, is it, how dense is it? I mean, is it a, how readable a book is it? Just out of curiosity.
Well.
Oh,
it's
there's
not
my
as
answer.
It's not as readable as I wish it were. It's not as readable as many of his quotations are. And you know, it's in some ways it reads like an exercise manual. You know, there are, but you know, I would compare it in some ways with Ignatian spirituality, with Jesuit spirituality,
Mhm.
and I would, well, I spent a lot more time with the Jesuits than the Salesians, so I'm probably partial in thinking that if you're looking for a structure, that you might choose the Ignatian structure. I mean,
I see from your bio, we share an alma mater together, so,
okay.
but I did not do my PhD there.
Okay. But Francis, the thing is that it sort of depends on when and how you read them. If
Mhm.
you've never been exposed to Saint Ignatius of Loyola, then Saint Francis de Sales can be eye-opening in terms of, or not eye-opening, but you know, in terms of providing a program and a structure
Mhm.
and a way of moving forward and an attitude towards moving forward. That's sort of what the introduction to the devout life is centered around.
But I did hear a little similarity to like the Saint Ignatius Examen. I mean, when you're talking about some of the things that he was talking about, and I
Yeah.
heard parallels there in terms of.
Yeah, and de Sales himself was educated by Franciscans and by Jesuits.
Mhm, mhm.
So there is some I think what Francis de Sales brings is this idea of gentleness and persistence, and the
Patience,
idea
right?
of the devout life as being the love of God, you know, and
Mhm,
being very practical.
mhm,
Whereas
mhm.
Ignatius is like, sometimes I think it's like for superheroes.
I think that's what I was trying to get at. This seems like a reasonable program. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm,
Whereas de Sales is sort of, you know, I think has more of the emphasis on the gentleness, especially when he deals with temptations, especially when he deals with obstacles. You know, basically saying, don't beat yourself up about these things, but turn to God. Turn to God in these troubles, and instead of focusing on, you know, striving and trying to perfect yourself, you know, just
mhm.
accept that, okay, during the spiritual life, it's going to be a struggle, but that's part of it. And as long as you don't give in, um, you you'll end up ahead. You know, it's interesting because when like I said, in some ways, you know, finding a Salesian is better than reading the introduction to the devout life. I don't necessarily recommend reading the introduction to devout life because of those. I would recommend going online and looking for some of his best quotes. I've tried to provide some of them, but there's actually what I would recommend. It's a little pamphlet called The Golden Counsels of St. Francis de Sales.
Mhm.
And it's very short, and it's I think it's available for like $1 or something from the Salesians, plus $5 or $6 for shipping and handling.
Mhm. Mhm.
But if you're looking for something to read and to sort of refer to and use as a spiritual companion, I would recommend this. It's culled from, I mean, he wrote thousands of pages, so it's culled from that. But it really gets to some of the nuggets. And it's readable.
Great.
So I would recommend the Golden Counsels of St. Francis de Sales.
Yeah, I put the link in the chat once you said that, but
Yeah.
you know, it reminds me, I mean, similar, if you want to make him accessible, reminds me, a colleague of mine, when I lived in New Jersey, wrote a book called St. Benedict's Toolbox. She's an Episcopal priest, and really just tried to, you know, again, take it and make it readable for both individuals and congregations to use. And a lot of folks use that because, again, you can read the Benedictine rule, but it's like when you can just, for many to make it, then, I mean, almost start here and then go to the bigger or to the more dense after you've been teased. But anyway, thank you.
Mhm.
I think it was interesting and a little intimidating that he said finding a good spiritual director is like 1 in 10,000. Ah, yeah. And also, I thought in those times, people did not have access to all the wonderful books that we have now. And I find that if I read a book prayerfully, those books have been my spiritual directors. And they seem a little safer than finding 1 in 10,000.
Well, he also recommends that if you pray for one,
Aha.
God will provide it. That if you really set that as a desire and pray for it, that one will appear.
And I've been kind of using that approach as ones that show up in my life because I often, that's how I pray about being of use or something like that. I kind of wait for things to pass by me.
But you know, in terms of what he says about friendship too, I think that goes hand in hand with what he was saying about spiritual direction. As a spiritual director, you know, should be a faithful friend too, and it doesn't replace friendship by any stretch of imagination, but they sort of come from the same place, you know, that you know, you don't go through the spiritual life alone.
Yeah, I have that experience not only from readings, but from groups. Uh, some groups we established in the pandemic, you know, book groups that we read chronic type books and discuss. I think I froze, sorry. Groups that focus on those things that he talked about: charity, devotion, Christian behavior, or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
We do have a few more minutes if anyone else would like to share. If not, next month we are looking at The Cloud of Unknowing by Anonymous. That'll be on the second Monday of September. I don't have my calendar in front of me, and Ellen's got the screen share on, but I think the second Monday of September is going to be September 13th. We'll be looking at The Cloud of Unknowing. In October, we're going to be looking at the at St. Bonaventure's The Mind's Journey into God, and then in November, we'll be looking at Meister Eckhart. And so second Mondays from 6:30 to 8, we hope that you will continue to join us for these Divine Friendship series with Alan Dillingham. And so, Alan, I will hand it over to you for some closing thoughts and some closing words. But before I do that, does anyone else have anything else they would like to share before we hand it over to Alan to wrap us up for this evening? If not, I do want to thank you again for your leadership, for your perspective, and for the opportunity for all of us to learn about someone who we didn't know anything about, and yet whose charism and spirituality is definitely very much needed and relevant in our society, in our culture today. And so we hope that people will take a look at the link that Martha put up in terms of the more understandable condensed version of Francis than the longer book. And so I hand it over to you, Alan, to wrap us up our time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Alan?
Thank you. In putting together this series, I tried to basically select writers that that either influenced me or that I'd heard about and should learn about. My hope here isn't necessarily that you go out and read the Introduction to Devout Life, but that you have that when you hear Francis de Sales mentioned, or his charism, or the Salesians, that you'll have more of a context to put it in and link it to other things that you've learned and used to help in growing your own spirituality and developing your own friendship with God.
Do you want to send us off with a blessing, Alan?
Oh, well, I'm not ordained.
So I guess I can do it then. So,
I have one.
Sandra, why don't you bless us? I come from a congregational background, and so I believe in the priesthood of all believers. So Sandra, do you want to give us a blessing?
Yes, I'm going to use a quote from Francis de Sales.
Very good.
Jesus is within you and has come to you and has come there for your happiness. And for some of my folks that aren't Christian, friends that aren't Christian, I would say love is within you and has come there for your happiness. Be happy. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good
Thanks for
night.
joining us. Hope to see you in a month. Take care.
Bye-bye.
I know.